Sold to settle her dead father's card debt at 16. A cowboy tore up the note and gave her a hearth. The note was folded in thirds, creased so many times along those same lines that the paper had gone soft as cloth. Lyle Cutter held it out to me between two fingers the way a man holds a dead rat by the tail, like it wasn't anything, like it was just paper. I remember looking at it, then looking past it at the girl standing behind him near the hitching post, and she was watching the ground. 16 years old, maybe younger. Hard to say, the way life had already put its hand on her. She had her father's old canvas coat on, the one that was 3 sizes too big, and her hands were pulled up inside the sleeves. She wasn't shaking. That's what I noticed. Girl in that situation, most would be shaking. She was just very still. Cutter said, $87 Holt. You settle what Deacon owed me and the girl works it off at the station. Cooking, washing, whatever I need. Papers legal. I had Judge Farrow sign it. I said, Judge Farrow's been drunk since Easter. Signature's still a signature. That was the fall of 1881. I was 44 years old, which doesn't sound old now, but felt it then. I'd been running the Broken Spoke, my place, 160 acres on the Cimarron, not much to look at but mine, for going on 11 years. Before that I'd trailed cattle up from Texas 3 times. Done some work I'm not proud of for a man in Abilene who needed horses moved without a bill of sale. And generally done what a man does when he's got no people and no fixed address, and the world mostly doesn't notice him come or go. I want to be honest about what I was that morning. I wasn't a hero. I wasn't riding in on a white horse. I was standing outside Tillman's Dry Goods with a sack of flour over my shoulder, and a list my hired hand Ramon had written out in his careful schoolboy hand. Coffee, lamp oil, axle grease, 10-penny nails. And I hadn't slept well because the north fence had come down in the wind, and 3 of my yearlings had wandered onto Cutter's land, and I'd spent the better part of the previous day fetching them back, which was how I came to owe Cutter a conversation I didn't want to have. He'd been waiting for me. I understood that later. The girl's name was Ada Deacon. Her father, Walt Deacon, had come to Cimarron County 2 years before from somewhere in Missouri, trying to start a small farm out on the flats. Bad land, bad luck, and Walt Deacon had a weakness for cards that his luck at farming couldn't support. He died in April, not shot. Nothing dramatic, just a bad chest that he'd ignored too long, and left Ada with a broken-down soddy, $4, a mule named for reasons I never understood after a president, and $87 in gambling debt held by Lyle Cutter. Cutter ran the Cimarron station, which was a way stop and a trading post, and whatever else Cutter needed it to be on a given week. He was 40, lean, with a face that looked like it had been left out in too much weather, and he had the specific kind of meanness that comes from a man who's been calculating every transaction his whole life and is very good at it. He wasn't stupid. He wasn't even exactly cruel. He was just a man who saw the world entirely in terms of what a thing was worth, and who held the note on it. The law, such as it was in that county in 1881, did not disagree with him often. I looked at the note again, then I looked at the girl. She finally looked up. I don't know what she saw in my face, but she looked at me the way you look at a man who might be a door or might be a wall, not knowing yet, just watching. I put the flour sack down on the boardwalk. I reached in my coat and took out my billfold, and I counted out $87, which was almost exactly what I had in it, and I held it out to Cutter. He looked at it. What's this? That's $87. What do you want for it? The note. He smiled, which was worse than when he didn't. Holt. What do you want with a girl and a debt note? I want the note, Cutter. Take the money or don't. He took the money. He handed me the note. I folded it once, just once, not along those old soft lines, but across them, and I tore it in half and then in half again, and I put the pieces in my coat pocket because you don't leave paper with a man's name on it laying in the street. Cutter said, you just bought yourself a problem. I picked up my flour. I said, go on then, Ada. She didn't move right away. I didn't look back at her. I went into Tillman's and started going through Ramon's list, and after about 30 seconds I heard the door and she came and stood near the end of the counter, still with her hands inside those sleeves, and she said very quietly, I don't know what you want from me. I said, nothing right now. You want some coffee? Tillman keeps a pot. She thought about that for a moment, then she said, all right. That is how it started. I want to say that I handled it well from the beginning. I didn't entirely. I drove her out to the Broken Spoke that afternoon with the supplies in the wagon bed and Ramon riding alongside on his gray. Ramon, who had been with me 7 years and knew me better than anyone, said nothing the whole ride. That was one of his gifts. Ada sat beside me on the bench and looked at the country, which was flat and yellow-grassed in the October light with the Cimarron Hills low and blue in the distance, and she didn't ask questions. I noticed that. She was a girl who didn't ask questions, which could mean many things, and I was careful in my mind not to decide too quickly what it meant about her. When we got to the Broken Spoke, she stood in the yard and looked at the house, which was small, one main room and a lean-to, log and adobe, with a good stone chimney I'd built myself, and the barn and the small corral and the garden that had gone mostly to seed since I had no one to tend it. I said, "There's a cot in the lean-to. That's yours, door latches from inside." She looked at the latch. She said, "Who built this place?" "I did." She nodded like that answered something. Ramon made supper that night, beans and salt pork and cornbread, and the 3 of us ate at the table with the lamp between us and not much talk, and afterward Ada washed the dishes without being asked. Ramon and I went out to see to the animals, and when we came back, she was in the lean-to with the door latched and the lamp out. Ramon said, in Spanish, which he always used when he wanted to say something private, though we both knew it wasn't private, "You tore up Cutter's note." "I did. He won't like it." "I know. He'll say things in town. He'll say things in town." Ramon looked at the lean-to door. He said, "She is very young." "She is. What are you going to do with her?" I said I didn't know yet, which was honest. What I did, in the end, was what I knew how to do, which was work. There was enough of it. The fence was still down in the north section. The barn needed caulking before winter. 3 of the yearlings needed their hooves looked at. The root cellar wanted restocking. I was short-handed, had been for a year, since my other man, Picos, had gone back to his family in New Mexico, and the place showed it. Ada turned out to be someone who needed to be doing something. I understood that kind of person, because I am that kind of person. The second morning she was up before me, which I hadn't expected, and had a fire going and coffee on, and she asked me what needed doing. I told her about the garden, and she spent 3 days getting it right, pulling what was dead, turning soil, covering the cold frames. I watched her working from a distance a couple of times, and she went at it the way a serious person goes at a thing, steadily and without drama. She could cook, really cook, not just the way hungry people call anything cooked food. Her biscuits were better than mine, and I'd been making biscuits for 30 years. She had her mother's recipes in her head, she said, her mother having died when Ada was 8, and she'd been feeding herself and her father since then. We fell into a shape, the 3 of us. Ramon was easy with her in the way he was easy with most people, warm and practical, and he taught her which snakes to leave alone and how to read the sky for weather off the plains. I was less easy. I have never been easy with people in close quarters, and I knew it. And I was careful not to be too much in her way, careful with my words, careful that she always knew where I was in the house before I moved in a direction she was in. She noticed the careful. About 2 weeks in, she said to me one evening, we were both at the table, she darning a sock, me going over the tally book, she said without looking up, "You don't have to walk that wide around me, Mr. Holt. I know you're not Cutter." I didn't say anything right off. She said, "I mean, I knew it from that first morning." "In Tillman's." I said, "Good." She said, "Why did you do it? Pay his note." I'd been thinking about how to answer that since the day I'd done it. I said, "Because I was standing there." She looked up at that, she thought about it, and then she went back to the sock. But something shifted. I don't know how else to put it. Something that had been tightly held in her went, not loose exactly, but less held. Cutter did, in fact, say things in town. The specific thing he said was that I'd bought myself a young girl for $87, and what did that tell you about a man who'd always lived alone and never married? He said it in Pate's saloon where it would do the most good, and it moved through Cimarron County the way things move through small places, fast and getting bigger. The first I heard of it directly was from Harlan Tibbs, who had the spread east of mine and was a decent man, coming over one afternoon to look at a bull he was thinking of buying from me, and who was uncomfortable enough about what he'd heard that he wasn't quite meeting my eyes. I said, "Harlan, you want to ask me something?" He said, "I don't want to. I feel like I ought to." I told him the truth of it, all of it, the note and the money and the tearing it up. He listened. He looked at the ground, he said, Cutter's telling it different. I know he is. There are people believing him. I know that too. Harlan looked at me for a long moment. He was 60-something then, had been in that county since before I got there, and his opinion mattered in ways that Cutter knew it mattered. He said, I believe you, Holt. It meant something, I won't pretend it didn't. But there were others who didn't, or who half-believed Cutter's version because it was more interesting, and that winter there was a coldness in certain parts of town when I came in for supplies. I felt it. I've always been a man who could feel the temperature of a room, and that winter some rooms were cold. Ada knew. I don't know exactly how, I hadn't told her, and Ramon, to his credit, had said nothing to her, but she knew. And one evening in January she sat down across from me at the table and said, People are talking about me being here. I said some. She said, What are they saying? I told her not the worst of it, but enough. She sat with it. Then she said, Does it bother you? I thought about it. It bothers me that Cutter gets to say it, not that people think it. Why not that people think it? Because I know what's true and what isn't. Cutter knows what's true too, and he's saying the other thing anyway. That's different. That's a choice. She was quiet a while. Then she said, When I was 12, a man in Jasper County told my father I was lying about something, and my father believed him over me. It was about something small, a thing I'd broken. But I'd told the truth and nobody acted like it. She paused. So I understand the difference. I said, What did you do? Stop talking much, she said, and for a second something wry moved across her face, and I realized that was the most she'd said at one go in the 2 months she'd been there. February came hard that year, a blue norther that dropped the temperature 30 degrees in 4 hours and drove snow sideways off the plains. We lost 2 calves and nearly lost the mule, whose name, Ada had explained to me with the straight face she used for things that were funny, was Martin after President Martin Van Buren, her father's inexplicable favorite. Nearly lost Martin, who had gotten out of the barn in the confusion of the storm and was found by Ramon the next morning standing in a ravine half-buried, hypothermic and obstinate. The 3 of us worked 3 days and nights in and out of the cold, keeping the cattle alive, keeping Martin alive, keeping each other alive. Ramon had a cough that worried me. Ada turned out to know more about livestock than I'd expected, her father having had animals before the drink took his good sense, and she worked without complaint through temperatures that would have broken most men I'd known. On the 3rd night, when the storm had died and the temperature had dropped to the point where the air hurt your face, and the stars were out hard and clear the way they get after a plains storm, everything washed clean and brutally cold. I came in from the barn to find Ada at the stove with coffee on and Ramon asleep at the table with his coat still on. And she turned and looked at me, and I was cold all the way through, hands gone past hurting to a kind of distant numbness, and she said, Sit down. I sat. She brought the coffee and she put her hand over both of mine, both of them wrapped around the cup, and held them there. Just held them until I could feel the warmth moving back in. She didn't say anything. She was looking at the cup, not at me. Her hands were not small, the hands of a person who'd worked since they were small. I didn't say thank you. It didn't seem right to make it small by saying thank you. I just sat there in the warmth she was offering and let myself take it. After a while, Ramon stirred and she went to make biscuits and the night moved on. But that moment stays with me, the particular warmth of it, the plainness of it. The fact that she'd done it without ceremony, without making it into something, the way good people do good things, just because they're standing there and it needs doing. I was 44 years old, and I cannot tell you how long it had been since someone had done a thing like that for me. I'm not sure anyone ever had, exactly like that. Cutter came to the Broken Spoke in March. He came alone, which surprised me, on a gray morning with melt water running in the yard, and he tied his horse at the post and stood in the yard and called out, and I came out to meet him. Ada was in the house. I knew she'd heard him ride up. He said, I want to make a deal. I said, last time you wanted to make a deal, I was out $87. He didn't like that. He had a way of going very still when he didn't like something pulled tight inside him. He said, I want to buy a piece of your north section, the parcel along the creek. The north section, 30 acres of the best water access on my land. I'd known for years that Cutter wanted that parcel because it controlled creek water that his animals needed in dry summers. It was why he'd run that fence boundary dispute 2 years before. It was why he'd been angling toward me in various ways for a long time. I said, "It's not for sale." He said, "Everything's for sale." I said, "Not that." He looked past me at the house. He said, "I'll give you $300 for the parcel and I'll stop talking about the girl." I looked at him for a long time. There was a meadowlark somewhere out past the barn, and it was singing, which was the strangest counterpoint to that moment. Cutter standing in my mud yard in his good coat trying to buy me. I said, "Let me ask you something. How do you live, being you?" His face did something, just for a second, that I don't quite have a word for. I said, "Get off my land." He got on his horse. At the gate he stopped and looked back and he said, "You made an enemy for $87, Holt." I said, "I made one, you made yourself." He rode out. I stood in the yard until I couldn't hear him anymore, and then I heard the door and Ada came and stood beside me, not touching, just standing there at my shoulder, looking in the direction he'd gone. She said, "I heard." I said, "You all right?" She said, "Yes." Then she said, "Thank you for the north section." I looked at her. She was looking at where Cutter had gone, and her jaw was set in the particular way it got, and she looked, I want to find the right word, she looked like someone who had been picked up and carried for a long time and was just now remembering they had their own 2 feet. I said, "Go on and get warm." She did, but at the door she stopped and she looked back at me and she said, "He's wrong, you know, what he says about you." I said, "I know." "No," she said, "I mean," she stopped, thought. Then she said, "You're the best man I've ever known. I just wanted you to know I know that." She went inside. I stood in the yard a while longer. The meadowlark was still at it somewhere out in the grass. The meltwater ran across the stones in the yard. I put my hand in my coat pocket and felt the torn pieces of that note, which I'd been carrying without thinking about it for 5 months, and I took them out and I looked at them. Then I let them go and the little wind took them and they blew off across the yard, and that was that. Spring came on, then summer. The rumors in town mostly ran out of steam on their own, the way rumors do when nothing dramatic happens to feed them. Harlan Tibbs had done some talking of his own. I learned later, not gossip, just the plain truth of what I'd told him, said quietly to the right people, and that helped. Cutter was still Cutter, but Cutter had his own history of hard dealing in that county, and not everybody believed him about everything anymore. Ada turned 17 in June. We knew the date because she knew it and said so matter-of-factly one morning over coffee, which was how she handled most personal information, straight and without performance. Ramon made a cake, which was ambitious of him and only partly successful, and we ate it anyway, the 3 of us at the table with the door open and the summer air coming through, and it was a good evening. She'd taken over the garden completely by then, and it was the best it had ever been, not just kept, but planned, with tomatoes staked and beans running up a trellis she'd built herself, and a row of sunflowers she'd put in along the fence for no reason except she wanted them there. I liked that. A person who plants sunflowers is not in despair. She'd also, quietly and without making a thing of it, started taking over the accounts. She had a head for numbers that surprised me, or maybe I shouldn't have been surprised because Walt Deacon had gambled badly but gambled, which meant he'd understood odds, and Ada had grown up watching. She found an error in my arrangement with the grain merchant in Cimarron that had been costing me $3 a month for 2 years. She told me about it with a kind of careful neutrality, not looking pleased with herself, and I felt approximately how you feel when you've been walking with a stone in your boot and didn't know it. I started asking her to look at things, the tally book, the agreements with the 2 ranchers I'd been selling yearlings to. She did it carefully and reported what she found and never made me feel thick about any of it. That was its own gift. In August, a man named Cord Lessing came to the Broken spoke. Lessing was 26, sandy-haired, the youngest son of the Lessing family that ran cattle on the other side of the county. Good family, good land, the kind of young man the county considered a prospect. He came ostensibly to look at 2 horses I had for sale, which was legitimate, but he also spent a great deal of time looking at Ada, which I noticed, and which she noticed, and which she handled with a flatness that I might have found funny if it hadn't made me aware of something I'd been not thinking about. He bought one of the horses, a good dun mare, and he came back the following week to buy the second, which he probably didn't need. And the week after that he showed up without any pretense at all and asked Ada if she'd like to come to a church social in Cimarron on Saturday. She looked at him for a moment, and then she looked at me, which I hadn't expected, and then back at him and said she'd think about it. He left and she didn't say anything about it, and neither did I. She didn't go to the social. A week after that she came to me in the evening when Ramon had turned in and the house was quiet, and she sat at the table across from me and she said, "I want to ask you something direct." I said, "All right." She said, "What do you see when you look at me?" I put the book down. It was a question that deserved my full attention. I said, "I see somebody who works hard and is honest and doesn't ask for much and is smarter than most people know." She said, "Do you see someone you're responsible for? Like a thing you did that morning in Tillman's that you're carrying?" I thought about that. No. "You've never been a burden to me." "Then what am I?" I said, "The best person in this house and probably in this county," which I knew even as I said it was more than I'd meant to say. I was not a man who said those things easily. She sat with that for a moment. Then she said, "Cord Lessing is a nice man." I said, "He seems it." She said, "But he looks at me like a pretty thing he'd like to have." "Yes," I said, "he does." "You never looked at me like that," she said. I said, "No, I didn't." She was quiet, then she said, "I'm going to say something, and if it's wrong, just tell me and I'll never say it again." She was looking at the table at her own hands. "I don't want to go to the church social with Cord Lessing. I want to stay here. She stopped. I waited. She said, "I want this to be where I belong, if you'll have it that way." I said, "Ada." She looked up. I said, "I'm 44 years old." She said, "I know how old you are." I said, "I'm not. I've never been any kind of easy person to be around. I've got no family that I know of living. I've been alone so long I don't always know how not to be." She said, "I've been alone since I was 8. I said, "It's not I don't want you to stay because you owe me something or because there's nowhere else. I need you to know that you could leave. You could go to your own life. You could go to any." She said, "Holt." I stopped. She said very quietly, with that straight, serious face she had, that meant she was saying exactly what she meant. "I'm not staying because I owe you. I'm staying because when I am here I feel like a person who matters. And I've never felt that before, not once. And I am not going to give that up for Cord Lessing or anyone." She reached across the table and put her hand over mine, same as that February night, both hands holding. I turned my hand over and held hers back. Outside, the nighthawks were going over in the dark, those strange sounds they make, coming back down the plains from wherever they'd been. The lamp was low. The house smelled of wood smoke and something she'd had simmering all afternoon. I didn't say a lot more that night. I don't think I needed to. We married in October, a year to the month after I'd torn up Cutter's note in the street in Cimarron. Harlan Tibbs stood with us. Ramon cried, which he denied until the day he died. It was a small thing at the courthouse, and then a supper at the Broken Spoke with about 12 people, and Ada wore a dress she'd made herself from cloth she'd ordered from a catalog she'd studied like a document. She was 17 years and 4 months old. I was 45. I know what some people thought. I know some of them still thought it, even with the wedding. There are always people who are going to think whatever they want. I had stopped, somewhere around March, with Cutter standing in my yard, letting other people's thinking be the measure of what I knew to be true. What I knew was this. I had spent 44 years being useful to various people and enterprises and stretches of country, and I had done it with some degree of competence, and none of it had ever, not once, come back around to me as anything that made me feel like it mattered that I'd existed. And then I had done one thing, torn up a note, put the pieces in my pocket, said, "Go on then, Ada," and it had made all the difference. Not to the world, not even to very much of the county, but to this one person. And this one person, it turned out, was what I'd been short of my entire life. Here is what I want to tell you, because this is the part I couldn't have explained when I was young and thought I understood what things were worth. The best morning I ever had at the Broken Spoke, and I had a lot of years of mornings there after that, good ones, hard ones, more than I ever expected to have. The best one was ordinary. Ada was 6 months along with our first. It was late April, early light, the air still cold, but with something under it, the smell of the earth beginning. I was at the table with coffee. She came out of the back, her hair not yet done, still in her wrapper. and she came and sat in the chair beside me, not across, beside, and she leaned against my shoulder and we just sat there. She said, "What are you looking at?" I said, "Nothing. Light coming through the window." She said, "It's a good window." I said, "I built it." She made a sound, half laugh, and her weight was warm against my shoulder, and the coffee was good, and the light was coming through. That was it. That was the whole morning. I have sat in the memory of that morning many times since, and there is nothing in it that would look like anything from the outside, and it is the best thing I know. The broken spoke is bigger now. We built out twice, once when Clara was born, once when the boys came. Ada's garden takes up most of the south side of the yard. The sunflowers come back every year. Ramon died in the winter of '89, the cough finally winning what it had been working on since that February storm. He died in his own bed in the room off the barn, which is where he'd always slept and where he wanted to be, and Ada was with him. And I was. And Clara was 4 and sat very still in the corner and seemed to understand in some way 4-year-olds sometimes do that this was the shape of things. Cutter sold out and left the county in '84. I don't know where he went. I don't think about him much. Ada runs the accounts now completely, has for years. She found us an arrangement with a buyer in Dodge that gets a better price on yearlings than anything I'd managed on my own. She is not, she has made clear, a woman who is managed or decided for. She is a woman who decided. She decided on this place, on this life, on me. And she'll tell you so if you ask her, in that straight way she has, looking at you to make sure you're actually listening. I think about that morning at Tillman's sometimes. That first moment when she looked up at me, trying to decide if I was a door or a wall. I hope I was a door. Not because she needed rescuing, she would have found a way through Cutter, Ada being Ada. But because the door was there to open, and I was the one standing in front of it, and there are moments in a man's life when he gets to decide exactly what kind of man he is. Not in a big speech, not in a showdown, just in whether he puts his hand in his billfold and counts out $87 and holds it out and says, "Take it or don't." I took my flour sack off the boardwalk. I said, "Go on then, Ada." She went on. And so did I for the first time in a long time. For the first time, maybe, ever, so did I. The light comes in that window every morning. I built it.